Howdy folks, Jason here of All Things Photo, and this is my review of the Nikon Z9. The Nikon Z9 is perhaps one of the most anticipated and needed cameras in Nikon's history. It's no secret that over the last few years, they've been lagging behind their competition. Now, in the past, whenever Canon would come out with something, Nikon would come out with something better, and then Canon would come out with something better, and then Nikon, and it just kind of went back and forth. Now, I left Sony out for a reason there. If you remember DSLRs, they weren't exactly king. But anyway, over the last few years, it just seems like Canon would get better, and Sony would get better, and Canon would get better, and Sony would get better, but Nikon just sort of stayed where they started in the mirrorless range. And they made some improvements with the version 2s of their 6s and 7s, but it still wasn't up to speed with the Canon R5 or the R6 or the Sony A7R4 or any of those. And so a lot of us Nikonians out there were starting to get a little worried. Well, when the Nikon Z9 was announced, their specs put them on par with their competition. And that is extraordinarily needed at the moment, at least for Nikon. Not to mention the $5,500 price point. Yes, $5,500 is a lot of money, but if you look at the other flagships out there, it is the lowest out there. The R3 is $6,000 and the Sony Alpha 1 is $6,500. Now, like I said, $5,500 is a lot of money, but the fact that they were able to produce the camera that they did and come in at a price point lower than their competition will definitely benefit them in the long run. The first thing I want to talk about is actually the ergonomics of the camera. Now, I have big, meaty hands. I have been a Sony shooter in the past, and my biggest issue with Sony was actually the ergonomics and the fact that when I would put my hand on the camera, a lot of times my knuckles would even rub the lenses, cause blisters and pain, and it just wasn't fun to pick up and shoot. The Nikon Z9, the ergonomics are what you would expect from a Nikon flagship camera. Not to mention, you've got a vertical grip that's built into the camera. Everything feels like a Nikon. It feels like it's supposed to. All of the buttons are in places that you can get to real easy, and you've got plenty of customizable buttons and access to most of those buttons when you're in vertical mode. And so the ergonomics of the camera, outstanding. It is built like a tank, like a Nikon flagship camera should be. It is weather sealed, it has a magnesium alloy for the inside, and it feels like you could drop it and keep shooting. But we're not going to do that, are we? No. All right, frames per second. This camera will do 20 frames a second in their full RAW. It will also do 30 frames a second if you want to shoot JPEG, or 120 frames a second if you want to shoot small JPEG. I personally do not have a use case for the 120 or the 30. I barely have a use case for the 20, but it's nice to have. But some folks out there, if you're a sports shooter, the 30 frames a second, the 120 frames a second is something that you can absolutely use, probably on a regular basis, to get that very decisive moment. The good news with the frames per second is that you don't have to be at 20. You can change it to 10 or 5 or whatever feels comfortable for you. You can set your high range or low range so you can easily swap between the two. If you don't want to shoot 20 frames a second all the time, which, let's face it, who wants to do 20 frames a second for a portrait session? That would be a very long day at the end of the day when you're trying to edit all your photographs. But the fact that you can change it, you can do the single shot, you can do all those things is wonderful. I think the burst rate is excellent and it sounds awesome. With those 20 frames a second, you're going to need a good buffer. Otherwise, you're going to outrun the camera and you're going to be waiting, and that's no fun at all. Nikon talks about the camera being able to do 1,000 frames before you catch up to the buffer. Now, there are some caveats there. You have to use the industry's best cards, and you have to use their lowest RAW setting that they have. But still, 1,000 frames, that's pretty insane. I have zero use for 1,000 frames. Usually my bursts are just a couple of seconds, depending on the action that I happen to be shooting at the time. But maybe for you, the 1,000 frames before you hit the buffer is needed. Now, I've never run into the end of the buffer. I don't have the industry's top card, but getting 30, 40, 50 shots before running into the buffer is pretty nice to be able to do that with confidence. Like I said, I've never run up against the buffer, so they've made a lot of improvements, and the Xpeed 7 processor that they have inside the camera is doing its job well. Nikon chose to do something with this camera that was unexpected. There's no mechanical shutter inside the camera. Now, I certainly kind of raised my eyebrows when I first heard about it, and the more I read about it, the more I thought it was a risky move, and it was pretty cool that they did that. The concern was that there was going to be banding. Well, with their new sensor and with the anti-flicker technology that Nikon has in here, I have not experienced any banding at all in any situation that I've been in. And I've shot indoor hockey, I've shot wildlife, landscapes, I've done all the things that I love to do with the camera, and I haven't encountered any of those issues. Now, the sound of the shutter is electronic, and you can raise and lower that sound or even turn it off completely if you want. But there's no moving parts. You don't feel anything in the camera when you hit that button. And it's very strange and hard to get used to be honest, but it's kind of cool at the same time. I venture to say that we will see Nikon's competition in the future drop that mechanical shutter. Now let's talk about the blackout-free EVF. EVF is one of the main reasons why I wanted to switch to a mirrorless camera in the first place. When you look through an EVF, what you see is what you get, and that is excellent because you don't have to take the time to stop and look and chimp and make sure that you got everything. You can do it all right from the EVF, and you can even program buttons so that you can do the image review in the EVF, so you're looking through and you can check real quick to make sure you got your focus. So the electronic viewfinder is excellent. But in the Z6, Z6 II, Z7, Z7 II, the blackout was pretty significant. I don't think it was any more or less than some of the competition. I could be wrong. Someone will tell me that I am in the comments below, I know. But still, it wasn't significant, but we've always had some version of blackout with the mirror going up and down in the DSLRs, now with the new mirrorless cameras. So to shoot for the first time with no blackout whatsoever, it's actually kind of liberating. It's a very weird thing to say, but when you're trying to shoot flying birds, which is very difficult to do in most cases, not having anything distract you from the subject is excellent. And there's no blackout in this EVF at all. Now, I do have to say one negative thing about the EVF, but I think they're probably going to fix that in a future firmware, is that if your finger is halfway down on the shutter release, or it's on the AF on button on the back, everything is as smooth as silk. But the second you take your finger off, or if you turn the camera on, the EVF, and you start looking through fast-moving subjects, it can be a little jittery. And that seems very strange to me. But like I said, you push that halfway down to kind of activate and get the camera moving. Everything is smooth as silk, and it works flawlessly. Now, I suspect future firmware updates will fix that. But that is one thing to consider. Again, finger on the button, no problem at all. The image quality. The Nikon Z9 has a 45.7 megapixel sensor, and the files off of it feel like Nikon files. Now, for the Nikonians out there, no explanation is required. For everyone else, shoot a couple of images with a Nikon, load them onto your computer, and then you'll understand a little bit more about what we're talking about. There's something about the Nikon files that I don't know, I just like them a little better. I was a Nikon shooter, I swapped to Sony, and I came back to Nikon, and one of the reasons was the Nikon files. Now, could I make the Sony files look like I wanted? Absolutely. But when I start with a Nikon file, they just feel a little better to me. It is a personal choice, of course. The DxO mark is out on the Z9. It scored a 98, which is exactly even with the Sony Alpha 1, and the Nikon Z7 II has a 102. Now, I would suspect that it drops off a little bit because it is a stacked sensor, which is how you get the blackout-free EVF, but we're not talking about a whole lot of drop-off here. And the dynamic range looks right up there with the Z7 II, which makes it absolutely wonderful. It's kind of a perfect camera That 45.7 megapixel is in that sweet spot. Makes it great for wildlife, landscape, portraits, action shots, indoor shooting. You can do pretty much anything you want to with the Z9. Customization. There are a ton of buttons on here. Now, I've heard some other YouTubers talk about they wish they could do more with the buttons or that they had more buttons, but I got to be honest here. I've run out of things to put on the buttons. I don't know what else to do. I have several that don't have anything of value because I don't know what else to put there. So the customization is wonderful. And then you want to talk about the shooting banks. You've got 4 shooting banks, and then you have 4 custom menus that you can also assign, and you can cross-reference those. You can have the shooting bank A and the custom menu of C, however you want to do it. So depending on the kind of photography that you're doing, if I want to go shoot hockey, I've got a hockey setting on this. So I just pick it up, I turn everything to the hockey setting, and I go to the rink and I start shooting away. I have the same for any action and wildlife, for portraits, and for landscapes. So any way that you want to shoot, you can set it up, customize it how you want to do it. And each customization, you can change the buttons if you want. You can have the buttons in A do different than B, and so you can get really confused and spend a few days trying to remember exactly how it was that you mapped it out. So, battery life. The Z9 uses this big old battery right here, and so far in the field I haven't had to change it once, which is good because it took me a long time to get a second battery, which I finally have now. But again, I haven't had to change it in the field, all day shooting, doing videos, doing all kinds of things like that. I've not had any issue. The battery life is exceptional. Whatever calculations that they use, when they tell you it'll do 700 shots, they're absolutely, I don't understand. Maybe it's take a shot, go get a cup of coffee, take another shot, go get lunch, come back and take another shot. I don't know, but I've been able to take thousands of photos on here without having to change that battery. But it's always good to have a couple of batteries on standby if you happen to have them, just in case. Autofocus. Holy cow. Now, I was a Sony shooter for a little while, so I understood the really good autofocus. So when I came back to Nikon and the Z6 II, I was a little bit let down by the difference. There's a big difference. The Z9 is like nothing I've ever used before. And there's so many different settings. The 3D tracking is phenomenal, especially for sports. And for birds and wildlife, you can tell it exactly which one to look at. It'll grab on, it'll find the eye, it'll stay with them. It is exceptional. Is it perfect? No, absolutely not. It will on occasion. If there's a super busy background, it'll lose that subject, just like any other camera in the world out there. But for Nikon, this is a huge leap forward, and it is a joy to shoot, and I can worry more about the composition and the subject than I do about the placement of my autofocus points, and I can let the camera make a lot of those choices for me. And it is, it's lightning fast, it turns on super fast, so I can pick it up and just immediately start shooting, and it will grab the subject and go straight to the eye, and it's absolutely wonderful. I've had a chance to shoot birds with it more than a few times since I've got it, and I think I've gotten more keeper images in one session than I had my entire career shooting, just because if I want to take 50 shots of this bird flying by, well, there's a good chance that like 48 of them are going to be sharp tack in focus. So the autofocus for the Z9, outstanding. And it's going to get better. My final thoughts on the Z9. This is my favorite camera of all time. I have been shooting for a considerable period, and I've had many cameras, but this is by far my favorite. It is a joy to pick up and go out and shoot. So if you're on the fence about it, and you're a Nikon shooter, buy the Z9. If you're just getting into photography and you're not sure what brand to go with, I can recommend Nikon because they have the Z9, and I foresee this technology being filtered down into their other cameras as time goes on. So Nikon, this is a big win for you, and I'm glad you produced the Z9, and I'm glad I have it in my hand. So thanks for watching. Make sure you like and subscribe below and leave a comment. Now, grab that camera, get off the couch, escape, explore, and create.